AM radio continues to be a hot topic in the radio industry news. This time, Congress has jumped into the discussion after Ford said they're removing the band from their radios, then backtracking and saying that they'll keep it. Others in the industry are coming down on both sides of the issue, while stations are kind of caught in the middle. Congress has introduced legislation in both houses that mandate AM radio in vehicles. It's called the AM for Every Vehicle Act. And this would require that automakers keep AM radio receivers in their new vehicles for free. While this concept is slightly similar to the push to require cell phones to enable the FM chips that are built in, this retains the functionality of radios in vehicles, something that everyone has come to expect for over 100 years. In fact, it wasn't until the early 1970s and early 1980s that FM stations became more abundant than AM stations. But this legislation that has been proposed would have the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration requiring the automakers to have AM radio functionality in cars without a fee or charge. It also instructs the Government Accountability Office to see if there's something that is as reliable and resilient as AM broadcast stations, and is capable for ensuring the presidents or their designee to reach more than 90% of the population in time of crisis, including at night. It says to investigate the cost of said replacement system and to coordinate with the FCC and FEMA, as they're the controllers of National Public Alert and Warning. I know many advocates of the removal of the AM radio service state that iPOS and WEA are more than capable of providing that replacement. Well, I beg to differ. While the reach of the cell networks has expanded in the last few years and has become way more ubiquitous in our everyday life, we see many times when the cell networks show their fragility. Cell companies used to require hours of on-site battery backups, and the phone system used to have massive battery plants that would keep the systems up for a long time. But that's no longer the case. Many constructed cell sites recently do not have any on-site backup power capability. Sure, they'll have the plug for the trailer-mounted generator to roll up and plug in, but that requires the generator to be towed to the site, secured, connected, and switched on. That's not practical or possible in a disaster situation. I guess I also need to kind of back up and define what I'm meaning by a disaster. In this instance, I'm defining a disaster as any event that interrupts the normal operation of power or communications. A backhoe that severs the fiber lines that connect a community. That's a disaster. There are so many communities that are served by one or two cables, even larger-sized communities. A few years ago, I was driving back to Orange County from Las Vegas on the 15 freeway, and we came over a hill, and suddenly us and the thousands of cars on the freeway had no cell signal for the next 100 miles. What had happened? More than likely, a breaker tripped, taking down a microwave link that feeds all these different sites. Sure, it's a bunch of desert and nothing that's out there, but how many thousands of people were traveling that day on the freeway? That is a disaster. And if that were to happen, and your new electric vehicle doesn't have any radio capability because the automaker didn't want to spend the few cents to filter out the electric motor noise and figured that you have a cell phone, and everyone has a cell phone these days, you'd be out of touch if a dangerous situation happened ahead on the road. We can debate all day about, well, what about the people who are listening to the music on the phone, or well, what about the people who were listening to cassettes and 8-tracks in their cars before that, or had their radios off? Let's also look at the way both systems disseminate data. The cell networks are basically IP networks, just like your home or office Wi-Fi. Every time you go to Facebook or watch one of my videos on YouTube, you are making a one-to-one connection to a server. Using this video as an example, if you're watching it in HD, you're using about 8 megabits per second. Now multiply that by 10 people. That's 80 megabits per second. Let's say that there's 1,000 people. That's not hard to get with an apartment of people. That's all of a sudden, 8 gigabits? If we're going to rely on WEA and iPOS and the internet as our method of public alert and warning, when a disaster happens, all those people are going to be flooding to official sources and news agencies trying to get information. What do we say in these alerts? Tune to your local radio or TV, or find an official source of information. People will go online. If they're all watching a live press conference, that's a lot of strain on the internet infrastructure. Now let's look at broadcast radio. Just for the sake of discussion, let's use the same 8 megabits per second figure, even though for AM or FM station the amount of data would be much less. The station puts the audio out. That's 8 megabits per second. One person is listening at that data rate. Now 1,000 people are listening. That's still just 8 megabits per second. Let's change that to 1 million people are listening. That's still just 8 megabits per second. That's because the difference in delivery. It's called broadcast radio because the information is broadcast. It's a one-direction path of content from broadcaster to receiver. One to many is what we say. The internet needs a one-to-one path. Yes, I know there's multicast and cell broadcast, but those don't really work on the public internet at this time very well. So we'll leave those off to the side. Back to the topic of AM radios and the cars and the legislation. It's significantly more efficient and reliable for broadcast radio to put out the alert and warning than it is to rely on cell phones. It's getting kind of dark out here, so let's open things up a little bit more here to try to get a little bit more light. Where was I? Oh, right. But Marcos, there's no good AM stations out there. They're all trash. Well, that's a pretty harsh generalization. You may not like the content that the AM stations in your area are putting out, but does that mean that they are truly trash? Sure, there are many AM stations who are really not serving the public and sound horrible. In fact, where I live now, one of the big legacy AM stations sounds absolutely horrible. But that's not the topic of this video. We'll move on. People can still tune into the station to get emergency news and information, even if their cell phones no longer have a signal or have power, even if their cell phones die, even if the Wi-Fi at home doesn't connect to the internet, they still can get the radio stations. And that is why I believe it is important that we don't remove AM radios from cars.